But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we dive into the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, the Trust Buster who took on monopolies and fought for fairer economies. His square deal aimed to protect workers, consumers, and small businesses, redefining the government's role in American capitalism. Was he a reformer or a political pragmatist? Let's find out. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we're heading back to America and finishing off our story from last time, where we talked about President McKinley, him getting shot, and then this new kid on the block, if you can put it that way, named Teddy Roosevelt, is basically considered an accidental president by many who no one really expected to become president, ends up becoming president, and, well, he's on Mount Rushmore now. So I think, you're going from that level to Mount Rushmore. I don't know if there's much more I need to say, at least from an intro on, when you think of the top 4 presidents of the United States that get their faces chiseled into the side of a mountain, he was one that was picked.
It's interesting with Teddy Roosevelt, right? I think everyone knows of him, but they don't necessarily know a lot about him. And, I was talking to someone about this episode and I was doing research, and the first thing they said was, oh, speak softly and carry a big stick. So I think, his his aura kind of represents him still in the modern zeitgeist. But a lot of people don't understand his story or know his story very well. And his story it's almost Hollywood-like in many respects. The things that he was able to accomplish, the journeys and adventures that he went on while also being the president, it's quite amazing.
Absolutely. And what I think was so great about him is he accomplishes all these things, but there's always this layer of humility, I think, that comes through his life. And then we see those really human moments when tragedy strikes, when he has some really joyous moments in his life where he's able to stop and reflect on the little things in life. I think that really grounds him in just kind of, being a person like the rest of us, but then also completely different to anybody you will ever meet, maybe in history, which I think is what makes him so fascinating. And he's got a very long life. So I think it's probably best we just jump right into his bio right away and get started with that. So he's born in October 1858 in New York City, and he's really born into privilege. He's it's this Gilded Age that's really rising in America, and he's born into a very wealthy family. His father is quite wealthy, known for being a big philanthropist within New York City, but he's born very sick. He has really severe asthma, and when he recalls his life, he says, I was a sickly, delicate boy. I suffered from this chronic asthma, and it was kind of touch and go with him for a little bit. People were kind of saying, like, we kind of have to shelter him a little bit. If he gets sick, this could be really bad. And so he was kind of at that point where he was trying to kind of figure out as a kid, well, his parents at least were trying to figure out as a kid, how do we just keep him alive? But how do we not coddle him so much that he grows up and he's never really experienced anything in the world? And reflecting on his life, he talks about his father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., who he describes as, the best man I ever knew, a person with combined strength, courage, with gentleness, tenderness, and great unselfishness. And he looks at kind of how his father kind of instilled into him was this fierce will to survive and thrive, but not to a point where, you're just letting him out into the wild. Still showing him that love that he needs, but allowing him to experience things a little bit. And I think that's kind of what he sees in his life is how do they find that balance for him? Because they know like he has a very serious medical condition, but at the same time, he's like his father in that sense, wants to experience the world. He's going to have opportunities that no one else has. You don't want to keep him bottled up for, an extended period of time.
Yeah, he really does look up to his father quite a lot. And I think it's an amazing relationship. And early in his life, there's a quote here because he was encouraged by his father who told him, you have the mind, but not the body. And without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. And I think this kind of determined, him as a teen to take on what would become a very vigorous regimen of exercise. He had a homemade gymnasium. He took up boxing lessons. He rode horseback tirelessly. And over time, he kind of transformed himself from a very frail youth into a very sturdy young man. And what he profoundly called, in a book that he published called The Strenuous Life, this kind of ethos about the highest form form of success comes not from the man who wants an easy life, but the man who doesn't shrink from danger or adversity, but it comes from this kind of hardship or from bitter toil. And I think that's kind of a sentiment that we're going to see a lot, not just throughout his personal life, but also his life in politics.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's so interesting that he's growing up in, when we talk about privilege in this day and age, most people are quite poor, if not dirt poor at this time. And to be part of that small elite where you're given everything that you need, there's definitely a tendency to fall into kind of the easy life and just kind of going through the motions. But, he's given this huge challenge that he has in front of him. He needs to, like you said, make a body. He needs to get healthy and be able to thrive in a way that he can, but he needs to, get there physically. And you're right, like the boxing, the camping trips, fighting other kids sometimes, something that he continuously works at. And as a family, they take a lot of trips to Europe. They went even to Egypt. So he's able to see the world a little bit, but also part of it is hiking in the Alps as well. So, this is not easy work. And, slowly but surely he starts to build that body up and to build, just a stronger base around him where, his illness is not something that's really holding him back to the extent that it was when he was young. But he's also got this just fascination side of things. He's such a curious kid that we really start to see this with animals and natural history. So if we know anything about Teddy Roosevelt, known for the national park system and just a real love for nature. And this starts really young. He actually created something called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. And he basically took a bunch of insects, shells, animal specimens, put them in his bedroom and called it the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, where he's, spending time observing wildlife, dissecting animals, reading scientific texts, and just this passion for zoology and the natural world really starts at a really young age. Part of it being when he was really young is kind of being cooped up and not really being able to do anything. So he's reading books, he's looking at things that people bring him. But as he starts to get a bit older, he's going out into the natural world and observing things, looking at things. And this is really a true passion that he's going to have for the rest of his life. But it starts pretty much at a very young age.
I think that's one of the interesting dichotomies, right? And we'll see this, theme across this episode. But this is someone who comes from a very privileged background. But I think his household really focused on this idea of public service and, morality to serve others and lift others where, these were revered values in that household. And it's an interesting blend of privilege and compassion that I think, really does symbolize his life over its entire duration. And it's even more interesting when you contrast it against this kind of Gilded Age, which is really, kind of this, time where there's a lot of self-interest. It's kind of demarcated by, the robber barons, who were a very powerful group of 19th century American businessmen who were seen as having used, very exploitative practices to amass their vast wealth during the Gilded Age. And the term is kind of used pejoratively to criticize, very monopolistic tactics, exploitation of labor, and like kind of this undue influence over politics. To your earlier point, Paul, most people are pretty poor in New York at this time, but wealth is amassing in the hands of a few. And these are kind of the key characteristics of the robber baron. So you have this contrast again. You have monopoly power, very aggressive business tactics, worker exploitation, a lot of political influence, and, philanthropy, quote unquote, which is somewhat controversial because these people would donate large sums later in life to universities, libraries, and charities, but they might have just been trying to save face at the end of the day. And, some notable robber barons would be, these are names we always hear: John D. Rockefeller in oil, Andrew Carnegie in steel, Vanderbilt for railroads and shipping, J.P. Morgan in banking, Jay Gould in railroads. This is kind of the arena that he is growing up in.
Yeah, I think it's when I always think back of this time, I just think of all these guys as industrialists, where it's just they've got just a bunch of stuff that they're doing and they're making more money than they know what to do with. And you're right. We start to see these hyper-productive companies really start to pull away from a income standpoint. And that divide is really starting to grow. And you're right that, donations back to, the city or the state, whatever that might be, there's always an element of, what's the true motivation here? But it's definitely something that's key in this time period. And with his father, definitely falls within this kind of elite social standings. But one thing that his father kind of instills on Teddy at a very young age is Teddy's father never fought in the Civil War. And that always something that nagged at him, because you had mentioned it earlier, Richie, about that sense of duty and how it's been so instilled in him as a family. It's been instilled, but his father, just the regret of not being able to fight and serve his country is something that eats away at him for the majority of his life. And Teddy sees it. And it's something that he's telling Teddy straight up that, hey, I'm really regretting not going into war. And it's going to be important as we get later into Teddy's life when there's an opportunity to do something, he's going to take it pretty much every single time. So as he kind of goes on with his life, he's really known as someone who's just, I like this. He says he reads books as energetically as he chops wood. A friend and a historian said about him, he said he was just pure energy. This kid never stopped. Like we said, he's always exercising, he's working out, he's practicing boxing, but he's reading and trying to learn about the natural world and other things as quickly as he can. And that brings him to Harvard University when he ends up going to school, and he majors in natural history. He rose crew. He continued boxing despite actually having a really hard punch that broke his nose, and he became a part of the elite club called the Purcellian. So right away, he's instilled in this elite school, studying the things that he loves, being able to keep that physical lifestyle up as well. But this is where we really see tragedy strike for Teddy. In 1878, while he's at Harvard, his father passes away, and he idolizes his father, like we mentioned, and really that moral and civic virtue is the biggest thing that he takes away. And one of the quotes that Teddy Roosevelt Sr. said to Teddy was, "Take care of your morals first, your health next, and finally your studies." So really, it's a great kind of way to encompass Teddy's life. Is basically he's taking that as put your morals first, put your health second, and then everything else can come after. So it's a really tragic part to his life. And just to kind of give you an idea of, when we talk about, hey, he's really rich from an inheritance standpoint, Teddy inherits $60,000 at this time, which translates to $1.7 million US today. So he's pretty much set up for life, or pretty close to it. So, this is definitely going to allow him to experience some of the things that he wants to experience, but he's lost probably the most important male figure in his life, and he's really devastated by it. And it's a really tough time for him at this time.
And he's a pretty young man at this point. Like, he's in his early 20s, I imagine, right? It's right before or right after he graduates from Harvard. Yeah,
it's 1878 and he's born in 58. So just around 20. Yeah, so he's still a kid, really. He's really just trying to find his way in life. And after he graduates, he does a couple things. Well, first, he gets married. So he marries his first love. Her name is Alice Hathaway Lee. And this is where life starts to kind of turn for him a little bit, because he reflects back on his time at school. And interesting as his life sounds, he's studying natural history, he's rowing crew, he's part of an elite social club. He didn't really enjoy his college time that much. He analyzed his college career, and he looks at the benefits that he had, and he felt that he didn't really obtain a lot from Harvard. He was pretty depressed by how formulaic everything was, how rigid it was, and the attention to very small details. But he said, I'm doing all these things, but they never seem to link together as a whole. And it's something that he just really couldn't wrap his head around. And it's not something that he necessarily would say enjoyed or found useful. So I guess at this point, he's just trying to do something a little bit different coming out of school. And like I said, he gets married, and then he starts to look at politics. So he's 23, and he begins attending meetings at Morton Hall, the headquarters of one of the districts of the Republican Party in New York City. And he actually wins a seat in the New York State Assembly. And right away, 23 years old, he's into public service, and this is going to be where his life is going to be for the rest of his life. It happens really quickly, and again, starting to maybe see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel for him. He's dealt with his father's death, not really happy with his schooling, but he's now serving his people, serving the public, and that's definitely something that's important to him. And it's nice to kind of see that things are moving in the right direction. But maybe, as you can tell by the tone of my voice, it's this exciting kind of light for him is not going to last very long.
I think it's also interesting to mention, I don't know if you came across in your research, Paul, but there's this idea that we've covered in other episodes about political machinery, which is a very interesting concept that I didn't really have a lot of foray into, even with a history background. And something came up while I was doing contextual research around Tammany Hall, which was the democratic political machine that dominated New York City politics in that part of the century. It started in the late 1700s as a social club, the Society of St. Tammany, but evolved into a tightly controlled political force, especially from the 1850s to the 1930s. So if you're asking yourself, what did Tammany Hall do? So essentially, they controlled elections by mobilizing immigrant voters, especially Irish Americans. They rewarded loyalty with jobs, contracts, and favors. It's essentially the essence of cronyism or patronage. They manipulated city governments to enrich its leaders and allies, and helped immigrants get housing and legal aid in exchange for votes. So it kind of just shows you the political machinery that he's up against as a Republican. And, this is an era that when we look at the Gilded Age, we look at, exploitation, we look at the wealth in the hands of the few and many having little to no money. It's a very ripe situation for someone like Teddy to come in, because I think he's got the right morals for it. He's got the right head on his shoulders, and he's not not someone that we're going to see, is going to abandon his moral fervor to appease the few that have been in control.
Yeah, and he's going to ruffle some feathers along the way too,
yeah.
right? Like you said, if this political machine exists and you want to be part of it, you got to play ball. And if you're not going to play ball, this machine is going to try to take you down. And it's going to take someone very, very popular and famous amongst the people to be able to do that. And we'll see how Teddy kind of navigates that going forward. But you're right, these political machines exist, and really they are pulling the strings, for lack of a better term, especially with some of these smaller scale elections where, there's probably a few thousand people voting. It's not a nationwide thing. So yeah, pulling things one way or the other in just a small way can really change things. But for him, he's got this seat. He's launched his career into public service, but right away, tragedy strikes again. His wife gives birth, which is, again, really exciting, but there's some problems. There's a lot of complications from the birth, and shortly after she dies of kidney disease, just after giving birth to his daughter Alice. And so obviously devastated. His mother has come in to help out with the kid and just with this tough time. And doesn't she succumb to typhoid fever in the same house and die a few days later? So, two of the most important women in his life, his wife, the mother of his child, and his mother, are dead within a few days of each other. And in his diary, he drew a big black X on this day, and he simply wrote, "The light has gone out in my life."
Every time I hear that or read it, it still hits me right in the center of the gut. I can't imagine the grief that he was overcome with. There's got to be a degree of just inconsolability that no well wishes or thoughts are going to help him get through this. And I think this is where we see, at the onset of the episode, we talked about humility and, his humanity. And I think this is kind of one of those early chapters where we start to see his humanity.
Yeah, you're right. There's no, get back on your feet. You'll do all right. Like, having a child for the first time, I'm sure, is just a scary but exciting time in your life. A lot of uncertainty, but you're expecting to do it, with somebody by your side, or at least with that person, and then some support from your parents. Now, both of his parents are dead. His wife is dead. He's got a young girl. This is, he's got the finances and things to support him, but there's no amount of money that can fix this problem. And so for him, it looks like that the grief is just too much for him to stay in New York at this time. And Teddy Roosevelt, for someone who loves the natural world, he decides, you know what? I'm actually going to get out of New York, and not just out of New York City, out of New York State. And I'm going to go west, and I'm going to go very west, and I'm going to go into the Dakota Territory. And so this is, North and South Dakota at the time. And it's really what people would say is an untamed area. There's some native communities there, cattle ranchers, cowboy territory, if you want to put it in any other way. So he goes out there, he builds a ranch at a place called Little, Missouri, and he plunges into the life of a cowboy. He's this rugged kind of person meeting up with just typical cowboys. And it's funny because he shows up as this Eastern aristocrat, and people are looking at him like, all right, buddy, like, what's your deal? You're this rich guy from New York. You think you're going to come out here and just, boss us around and tell us what to do? But that's not what happens. He's known for just riding his horse for hours under the open sky just because something to do. And unfortunately, kind of with an undertone of trying to outrun his sorrow. He's got this almost like he's trying to fight through this hardship where he's like kind of pushing himself in so many different directions. So, he's chasing down horse thieves for days in sub-zero temperatures. He's patrolling cattle at midnight, and he's really kind of starting to gain the respect of people around him, because there's two sides to this. Yeah, he wants to be part of this life, but I think for him, it's if I can push myself hard enough, I can maybe forget some of the pain that I'm feeling from back home.
The imagery is quite powerful in so many ways, right? It's almost like he went through like a personal rebirth. And you touched on that story about how he got his boat stolen, his riverboat, and he pursued this trio of boat thieves through freezing weather, captured them at gunpoint, and then personally escorted them to justice. And he's doing this while he's, reading Tolstoy to pass the time on the return trek. It just goes to show you like the multifaceted nature of this very interesting young man. And he actually writes later that I've always said I would not have been president had it not been for my experiences in North Dakota. So I think in many ways he's crediting the frontier for restoring his spirit spirit and vigor. And I think, by the time an awful winter blizzard hits in 1886, it wipes out most of his cattle herd, which is essentially like a death blow to any ranching venture. He's proven to himself that he could overcome any trial. And he's also kind of lived out the myth of the Wild West. And this is also happening at a time as like the American frontier is closing, right? This is that whole chapter of Manifest Destiny that's kind of coming to an end.
Yeah, it's a quick time in his life, only 3 or 4 years, but so much happens there. And you're right, like at the end, wiping out all of his cattle for the most part, or half of the herd. That's pretty much, like you said, a death sentence out there. But, he's chasing down criminals. He's wrangling cattle. Like, it's really just, like I said, the classic cowboy lifestyle, classic Western. I found a couple of people here that he rubbed shoulders with. I just absolutely love names of cowboys. So there's Hell Roaring Bill Jones and Bronco Charlie, because, they can't just have normal names. They have to have some cool, Western kind of cowboy name to it. There's stories too of him being called Four Eyes by someone in a saloon, and he just got up and punched him twice really hard in the face and knocked the guy out. And so it's just funny because you have to really picture this aristocratic guy with his spectacles coming into pretty much the most rugged kind of terrain and the most rugged people you can find, and just fitting in and probably getting picked on, and people being like, who's this guy? And being able to knock a guy out in a saloon. Like, it doesn't get more cowboy, Wild West than that. And then he even serves as a deputy sheriff when he's in Billings County, North Dakota. And that's where you mentioned he's hunting down boat thieves. He's getting lost horses back, and he's just living the life of a lawman out in this rugged territory. And this is where, though, we see not only that self-resilience of being able to get away from these challenges of these really deep emotional pain that he's kind of running from. It's this grit that we've continued to see with Teddy, being told you don't have a body, but you have a mind, so you have to build a body. He goes and he does that. And then he just goes into a completely different part of the country and can fit right in with the common people. And nobody knows that he's this super rich guy, at least to the level that he is. And he doesn't let people know that either. He fits right in. He's seen as one of them. And when he kind of comes away from this, he really talks about how he values the common people. And he felt that this beauty and charm of the wilderness kind of was this nice balancing act for him as well. Just kind of grounded him within everything. And like you mentioned, like he said, it was so formative. He said it was a fine, healthy life too. It taught a man of self-resilience, hardship, and the value of instant decision. I enjoyed the life, to the fullest.
He lived out the strenuous life, right? This is that motif that he continues to go back to. How are you going to, forged in fire? What is going to take you to get made out of the metal that you need to be to rise up to meet whatever challenges you're going to face? And he doesn't just talk about it. He goes and he does it, and he does it very successfully. And then, he returns and then he's off to the races with his political career.
Definitely. Yeah. So that big storm hits. He's like, all right, I think my time here is up. And he heads back to New York, and he actually gets married again. So he marries a childhood friend named Edith Carow, and she's a devoted partner for him for the rest of his life. So they settle into a Long Island estate and start a new family where they would eventually raise 6 children, one of the daughters being Alice from his first marriage. And he has this rambunctious household with something that he writes about for just giving him such enormous joy. In some of his writings, he says, for unflagging interest and enjoyment, a household of children certainly makes all other forms of success and achievement lose their importance by comparison. And I think I love that quote because not only have we seen what he's done so far, but as he moves on in his life and he's accomplishing things that no one will even come close to accomplishing in their lives, he still at the end of the day grounds himself in saying, everything else in my life is fine, but being at home with a bunch of kids running around, nothing beats that. And that's what gives him, this level of joy that's can never be topped.
It's interesting. And it's just a side note that came to mind. We've done other episodes on presidents and, very formative leaders in the US. And I think almost never has someone brought up their kids in their diary as being one of the highlights of their life. I'm sure it's assumed or inferred that that is the case, but for someone to, write and be able to get quoted about that the utmost happiness is from their children really does tell you a lot about their character. And I think, again, it's this whole motif of him understanding what's really important and what makes, a man a man. And I think there's another podcast I listened to called The Art of Manliness, loneliness. And its whole motif is around the strenuous life. And I've listened to it for, half of my waking life now. I probably started listening to it when I was 16. And they continually refer to Teddy Roosevelt throughout all the episodes that they do. And doing research for this kind of galvanized all of it for me.
You're right. Like, I'm trying to think of anybody else that, kind of talks about, their kids, but kind of living this strenuous life. The only other one that comes up, definitely not a strenuous life by any stretch of the imagination. But I do remember when we talked about Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, which makes his story way more tragic when you kind of put this into context. But he writes a lot about just how much he enjoys spending time with his kids and how important that is to him, compared to everything else. Now, obviously for him, it doesn't end very well, but yeah, you're right. It's not something we see a ton of, and especially back in those days where a lot of times families were just kind of there, if that makes sense. Their father's off doing something, mother's just taking care of the kids, or they're being raised by, servants and nannies, those sort of things. And, to see him kind of be able to ground himself in that, I think is quite nice. But he's back in New York. There's lots of fun things going on there, and there's lots of elections to be had. And, he's not going to sit on his hands and just kind of let things go by. He's going to throw his hat back in the ring. And so he was actually approached by the Republican leaders about running for mayor in New York in 1886. And so he accepts the nomination, really despite having very little hope against, there was something called the United Labor Party, which had a candidate, Henry George, and a Democrat named Abram Hewitt. And so he campaigned really hard, but Hewitt ended up winning, and Roosevelt finishes third with 27% of the vote. So, a failure for him here, but again, a learning opportunity, and knowing that he's got his name out there. He's someone that's on the ballot. People know who he is. And so he gets right back into public service. So he spends time as the U.S. Civil Service Commissioner, crusading against what he calls the spoils system in Washington. And this really ruffles feathers because he goes hard into this enforcement of merit-based hiring. And people don't like that. They like kind of the way things work. They like hey, somebody, or you're the son of this person, you're going to get the top post versus people with merit. But it's something that people really respect. And this leads him to become the president of the New York City Police Board. And so I think this is worth taking a step back and taking a look at New York City at this time, because when we talk about New York City in the late 1900s, it's got a lot of problems. And one of them is a completely corrupt police force where small bribes, from all the way down to the cop running a beat to the chief of police, bribes and backroom dealings is par for the course along every level. And so it's something he's going to take a look at, but also New York is in a very interesting position at this time as a growing city that doesn't really have enough space or room or services for everybody that's coming in.
It's interesting because I think at this point, it's kind of a turning point for America. But for Roosevelt, I almost see him, in all of these roles that we've talked about at this point, he's kind of like a thorn in the side of the old guard. He's this very rare aristocrat who's aligned himself with reformers. He's a progressive Republican. He's determined to clean up the system. And by the end of the 1890s, this very young, energetic New Yorker has kind of built a national reputation already as this iconoclastic crusader. He had come of age alongside the Gilded Age of America. So he sees the opportunities, but he also sees the inequities. He's scarred by personal loss. He's tempered by the frontier, and he's primed to lead in what are going to be some very tumultuous years ahead.
Yeah, and he's very good at boots on the ground. He gets down there and sees what's going on. And one of the things for him was he meets a journalist he wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. And this is about the terrible conditions of the city's immigrants. So you have so many immigrants coming over from Europe, a lot from Ireland, and they are just struggling to really get to a point where they can, never mind thriving, but just to a point where they can have the basic necessities of life in New York City. And so by befriending this journalist, he starts to spend some time and look at what's happening within this city. And when he becomes police board commissioner or president of the police board, he looks at what the cops are doing. He looks at how the common people are forced to live, and he decides to take action right away. This corrupt police force is not working for the people. The people are suffering. He's going to make a difference. And it's funny you said he's ruffling these feathers. He's coming from this privileged background. Everyone's probably expecting that, oh yeah, he's going to play ball. But this is where we really start to see him kicking the status quo around a little bit. And one of the things that he would do was we'd go on these things called midnight rambles, where he would just roam the streets of New York City with typically his journalist friend, and he would catch our officers sleeping on duty, or he would catch them in saloons drinking, or being bribed in certain ways. And he starts firing cops. He's reprimanding cops. He's doing all these things to really fix the system. And he's doing it with so much, I guess, fanfare to it that the public starts to really notice this. And they're like, this is amazing. We love this. And so it really puts a lot of pressure on the existing police force that they got to clean up their act as well, because you might have liked the way things were going before, but those days are over. And, Teddy's here to clean things up, and he's got the public on his side, and he's got a journalist who's writing about these stories. And now we start to see Teddy as well start to understand how the media can be used. This is definitely a time where media empires are starting to grow, and he's using that to his advantage. And so he's able to clean up a lot of the police force and getting a lot of these police officers back to doing the work that they need to do and really trying to reform a broken system. But he makes a small mistake in doing this. Teddy's very much a person who sticks to his morals, loves the rule of law. He runs into a few challenges, though, because there's something in New York City called the Sunday closing law. And it's essentially a law saying that you can't open a saloon on Sunday. That's just the law. But it was such a lax law. You could pay a police officer a couple bucks and you'd be able to stay open on Sundays. But Teddy's like, well, that's against the law. We're going to stop this. And so he starts enforcing that law. So saloons are starting to shut down on Sundays. But there's a problem. People want to get their drink on. They want to drink on Sundays. And this leads to mass protests. And he's actually invited to one demonstration about, kind of fighting back against this law. And most politicians feel, well, I'm not going to go to that. He accepts, obviously. And then he goes and essentially people are yelling insults at him. And his kind of reflection was, oh, it was a great time. I was hearing what everybody wanted to say. They were directing them at me. And people were kind of sitting there going, oh, right, there's something to this guy. Like, if he's going to sit here and just be insulted and we're going to yell all these things at him and he's just going to take it, there's something different about this guy. But this is definitely the first time we see Roosevelt kick the tires a little bit of a situation and not really fully understand the scope of what's going to happen. And it does bite him in the butt a little bit in this situation.
And I think in the same vein, though, right, he's willing, to your earlier point, to have that boots on the ground kind of mentality. Well, if they want me to show up, I'm going to show up. Really kind of living up to that standard of being a man of the people. And for a politician to show up and get insulted and take it, is quite rare, I imagine, at this point, with all the cronyism that is going on. So it is, in one way, it might have, he might have miscalculated, but I'd also think to a certain degree, it could have had kind of like a 50-50 effect where they're like, well, he's here, he showed up to this demonstration and he's trying to understand why we're demonstrating and why it's so important to us. So again, he's still able to kind of counterbalance that kind of rule of law, the written law and its enforcement with what's actually happening on the ground and why does it mean so much to these people.
Yeah, and it's so funny because you talked about this Gilded Age and these just super rich people who just have no idea, like, again, why the book was written, how the other half lives. They have no idea what's going on. And Teddy's been embracing this his whole life, getting on the ground floor, not only because it's the right thing to do politically, but he genuinely enjoys it. He likes talking to people. He's a populist at its finest, and that's just going to be something that's going to go with him the rest of his life. But then when we talk about boots on the ground, that's a military term for the most part. We're going to talk about some real boots on the ground with Teddy Roosevelt. So it's time for America to go back to war. And so there's a lot of tension with Spain at this time. And Roosevelt has been what we would say beating the war drums in Washington, where he's quoted as saying, "I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." Now, remember, this is 30-ish years, 40 years after the Civil War. And to be saying, this country needs a good old war is saying something. But again, it's Teddy looking for any opportunity to, really exercise those morals and that sense of duty. And so he's in luck. In April 1989, tensions around Spain over Cuba escalate and the Spanish-American War break out, and Roosevelt seizes this opportunity for glory. And like we mentioned, his father never fought in the Civil War, always told him about how much of a regret this was. And so Teddy jumped at the first opportunity. And what he does is he organizes something that's a volunteer cavalry regiment, and it's known as the Rough Riders. And so this is just, you got to think of like anybody that Teddy's kind of hung around with, he's calling and saying, hey, I'm putting this squad together. Do you want to be part of it? So he's got this motley crew of Western cowboys, Eastern college athletes, American natives, and ranch hands all mixed together, kind of reflecting Roosevelt in a sense of who he is amongst the people that are going to be part of these Rough Riders. So, it's diverse, fearless, and really kind of wild and rugged. And he had a friend of his become official commander, and then Lieutenant Roosevelt is now, has this charisma and becomes the soul of this regiment, and they get sent to Cuba. And there's some interesting pieces along the way, but essentially they get to the Battle of San Juan Heights on July 1st. And then this is where we have a bit of a story where, he's urging his men forward under withering Spanish fire, saying, come on, boys, march, as the bullets, buzz past. I always like to take those stories with a grain of salt, but knowing Teddy, right, he's in the thick of it here. He's brandishing a pistol from the sunken USS Maine that was sunk outside of Cuba, which really kickstarted the war. And so it's just, there's so much happening here, and it's just kind of everything that he wants, which is kind of odd to say. He reflects on that, saying that was the greatest day of my life. It was just so triumphant. And then all these stories start coming back to the US about Teddy Roosevelt on his horse, brandishing this pistol, leading these men through fire. And, Spain is defeated quite quickly, decisively. And now, he's returning to America as a national hero. And that's all it really took. This is not a very long war. It's only a few months. And he's coming back as a hero, and there's these stories written about him, but it's this specific piece around these Rough Riders. Like, this isn't just he went in, was given command of the military. Now, these are people that he's handpicked from his life, and they encapsulate him so well, and he's become just such a unique person. People are really looking up to now as, a war hero and a person that, someone you want to look up to.
It's interesting, right? Because this is happening against the backdrop of essentially what many historians call like the rise of American imperialism. So as the 19th century is drawing to a close, the United States kind of stands at the brink of becoming a global powerhouse. The 1890s saw a surge of American interests in overseas expansion. So this is imperialism at its finest. This once very insular republic has fulfilled its manifest destiny across the continent, and now they're starting to look outwards. So you have very influential voices who are urging, the building of a modern fleet, acquiring strategic outposts abroad. Industrialists are hungering for new markets. And in this milieu, that's when, Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders find this arena to exercise this philosophy of the strenuous life on a national scale. But it's not as straightforward, right? But with the wrapping up of the Spanish War, it only lasts 4 months, from April to August 1898. So it's a pretty decisive victory. And because of it, Puerto Rico in the Caribbean is ceded, Guam in the Pacific, and the Philippines in Southeast Asia. So within 4 months, you now have the American empire is starting to form, and they're a colonial power now within 4 months. And at home, a fierce debate erupts between imperialists like Roosevelt, who believe that America should assume the burdens of world power. But then there's anti-imperialists like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, who warn that colonial domination betrayed these core American ideals. But Roosevelt obviously had no doubts. And in 1899, a speech that he wrote, that he delivered in Chicago, he thundered against those who would shrink from America's new role, declaring that American manhood demanded striving, not shrinking. Quote unquote, if we lose the viral manly qualities and sink into a nation of mere hucksters, then we shall indeed reach a condition worse than that of the ancient civilizations in the years of their decay. So in Roosevelt's mind, empire and honor, in my interpretation, were intertwined. And essentially, you're seeing the strenuous life on a national scale.
Yeah, it kind of gives me some JFK vibes of like, we do this because, it's not easy. We do it because it is hard. And that almost seems like what he's saying there. And it's odd because the core of America is, a colony breaking free of its imperial masters. And, and you can see why people are against what he's saying, but you're right. It's this, like, we just got to do it. It's difficult. It's weird. It's manly. That's what we need to go do. And the thing is, though, he lives by it. It's not the situation of we need to go to war and I'm going to send a bunch of sons of poor people and go. No, I'm going to be on the front line with them, or I'm going to send my sons to go do it. And I think just what for people when they see someone like Roosevelt, yeah, he can make all of these speeches, but at the end of the day, he's putting his life on the line to win these battles. And this is interesting because when Woodrow Wilson becomes president and we get to World War I in 1914, there's that isolationist, hey, we're going to stay out of this mentality, right? And so we'll see very quickly as the script will flip. But you're right, this is definitely the battle of American policy at this time. But for Teddy, like we said, he's a superstar now. He's come back to America and he's ready to get into the highest political office, well, close to the highest. First, he stops off and he became governor of New York in 1899. And this is where he's going hard after the party political machine. So you mentioned this machine, Richie. He's trying to break away that machine and really make sure that he can push through his progressive measures and push back against these old guard Republicans who are not having any of these more progressive measures. And some of those things we'll get into in his presidency, but think about workers' rights, for example. The Republican Party at this time is thinking, how can we protect big business, our friends in industry? We don't have to worry about workers' compensation, sick days, any of that sort of stuff. That's going to hurt their business. We don't want that. And he's pushing hard because he's been to these places. He knows these people. But again, he's ruffling so many feathers, but he's so popular. People love him. And so the old guard Republicans are going, oh boy, there's a bit of an issue here. We got to bury this guy somewhere. And where is the better place to bury him? Well, how about vice president of the United States? And so at this time, it's really the case. Vice president, it's very rare you see a vice president going on to become president or to really doing much else. It's kind of I don't want to say symbolic job, but definitely not in the way we think about the vice presidency today. So it's a job with little power. He's reluctant to leave, an active governorship for this, what he called a sleepy vice presidency. But, he's looking at the party and he's like, hey, what's best for the party? Okay, well, it's probably best if I go and support President McKinley's ticket. And that's what he did. He decided to step down as governor and accept the vice presidency from McKinley or with McKinley and then go off into that election.
And, this plan, if you listen to our episode on McKinley, this plan really does backfire. In September 1901, an assassin's bullet kills President McKinley. And suddenly, that damned cowboy or that bull in a china shop, as he was referred to quite often by party rivals, he's now the president of the United States. And with that accession, this bold new spirit of the imperial age is going to get carried over into a very bold new style of leadership. And this is where you kind of see a transition, contextually speaking. The Gilded Age is over. The progressive era has begun, and it's going to be ushered in by Teddy Roosevelt.
Absolutely. And I think he is the youngest president, at this time. He's only 42 when he becomes president. But what I absolutely love is some quotes around this time. So when he becomes vice president, there's one senator that snipped. He said, don't you realize there's only one life between this madman and the presidency? And then when McKinley is assassinated, Senator Mark Hanna, who is a very conservative party kingmaker, really, he distrusted Roosevelt. He said, now look, that damn cowboy is president of the United States. And so that's how they're looking at him, right? This cowboy, outsider, progressive. How are we going to stop this guy? And the answer is, you're not. He's far too popular. He's far too in with his way of thinking. And he's going to transform the presidency in a way that's never happened up to this point. So he transformed this office that he originally dubbed a bully pulpit. And he had this great platform to preach his ideas and rally the public. He determined to give every American what he called a square deal, tackling the social and economic ills of the 20th century. And so what we have to recognize here is the president of the United States at this time is not like the president of the United States we think today. We're recording this in the time of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is on TV, it seems like every single day, telling about his party message. Biden, Obama, George Bush, they all did those sort of things. That wasn't really the case back then. You didn't get a lot from the president in terms of policy and communication. But Teddy Roosevelt, he likes to be the life of the party. He wants to get up in front of the nation. And so that's what he does. He keeps talking about this square deal. And a historian named Edmund Morris actually says, for Teddy Roosevelt, the nation's highest office was never a burden. He loved the job, and Americans loved him for loving it. So you have to remember here, he's getting out, he's talking to the people. But what's really resonating with voters and with people is they can tell that he's actually having a good time doing this. He's having a good time fighting for them and making sure that they can get what he's calling a square deal. And this is making him wildly popular across the entire country up to this point. And he's just getting started, but he's got the backing of the people at this point.
And he does it swiftly. There is a number of acts and policies he implements to, that one appeal directly to the people, but are oriented to actually have, tangible outcomes to support workers' rights. One great example I'll just touch on quickly is the Great Coal Strike of 1902. So this is a very interesting one. It was a major labor strike by the United Mine Workers of America America in an anthracite coal fields out of eastern Pennsylvania. It lasted from May to October 1902, and it became a national crisis because it threatened to shut down the fuel supply for much of the entire country heading into the winter. This is the first time in U.S. history that the federal government intervened in a labor dispute as a neutral arbitrator. Rather than siding with business owners, it marked a turning point in labor relations and presidential authority during the Progressive Era. Essentially, the president's, position was, well, we could just take this over and, we'll help the workers, and therefore we won't have a national coal shortage. And he essentially forced the hand of these business owners to come to the table and, meet with the workers where they were. And what did the miners want? They want a 20% wage increase. They want an 8-hour workday down from 10 hours. They wanted recognition of the union, and they wanted improved safety conditions. And essentially this worked amazingly. And ultimately, as we've seen time and time again, it just kept adding to the public trust that he was building over all of these acts.
And I think we need to double down on how bold of a move this is. People are telling him, Teddy, this is political suicide. What are you doing? Because if you get this wrong, if this strike continues and people die over the winter because they don't have heat, who do you think they're going to come point the finger at? They're going to point it at you. And he says, fine, I'm still going to do this. And when he has that conversation, he walks away going, there's no middle ground here. This isn't going to get done. But what he does is very clever. He's clever and a bit sneaky at the same time. He says, I have my stenographer over here. Is it okay if she takes notes? Okay, yeah, they're taking notes. And then he's reading it back after, and he basically says, look at how these rich kind of coal executives are talking about this whole situation. Leak that to the press. Let them hear what's going on. And that's exactly what he does. And again, talk about ruffling the feathers of the establishment. And now he's understanding how to use the press really well, because he's going to continue to go after these guys. And so there was something called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed before Roosevelt was in power. And it's really all about looking at monopolistic practices. And so he's taking on massive corporations like Standard Oil. He's sued over a dozen monopolies, and people started to call him the Trust Buster because these massive trusts, aka monopolies, are taking over America, and competition is starting to get ripped away. And like we said, these rich families are getting richer, and it's really hard to compete. And so he's continuing to do that. And people are really starting to see, yeah, you are giving us a square deal here. You are fighting for the rights of the people, and you're fighting for, to break apart, a lot of this established norms, I guess, that have come throughout this Gilded Age. And this is where we get to his, famous quote that you mentioned off the top, Richie, was speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far. And really that's what it is. He's able to sit down and talk to people, but they know at some point, this big stick is the executive power and the executive branch of the United States government, and I'm going to swing it if I need to. But I'm going to ask you nicely first, and if you say no, I might ask you again, and if you say no again, well, here comes the big stick. And that's really what he does, to start looking at this bold leadership style, which replaced really a lot of passive government, but it really transforms America into a point where executive power is now the most powerful piece in the land, more so than, Congress and the Senate would be, in administrations past.
Yeah, I think, this kind of lens of the progressive era and its legacy really just shows that, the presidency has become this engine of change, right? He's transformed the relationship between the government and the people. And under his watch, the White House had become, the first kind of true modern presidency in some ways. He's using federal powers to regulate the economy, protect consumers, and conserve nature. And, he proved that he could directly lead public opinion and tame the excesses of capitalism without dismantling it. I don't think he's anti-business. He's pro-responsible business. And he is trying to get that square deal for everybody. And, he's quite successful at it. And even in the fights he picked and lost, they still paved the way for future reforms like income tax, labor protection ideas that would later become law under his successor. So even in his failures, he is changing the narrative or changing the way that things should be done.
Absolutely. And you're right. Like as he's moving through this era, he's doing what's right. He's going back to the lessons that his father told him. What are the morals that you're built? Work off those. And so with that, he does a bunch of stuff throughout his presidency. First off, he orchestrates the start of the Panama Canal after backing Panama's independence from Colombia, considering the canal his greatest achievement in foreign affairs. In 1905, he mediates the end of the Russian-Japanese War, which he wins the Nobel Peace Prize for, which is the first American to ever win that honor. The teddy bear comes around in 1902. to, based on a famous incident during a hunting trip in Mississippi where he refused to shoot a black bear that had been tied up for him, considering it unsportsmanlike. And so toy makers had started creating the teddy bear. He even creates the Food and Drug Association. So there was a novel that was written about the filthy conditions in meatpacking plants. So what does Teddy do? He marches right into some of those meatpacking plants and goes, yeah, we're basically poisoning the people of our country by the way we produce meat in these unsanitary conditions. So he creates the Food and Drug Association, this Meat Inspection Act, really laying the groundwork for commercial consumer protection. And then finally, he takes over 230 million acres of public land, 150 national forests, 51 bird sanctuaries, 5 national parks, and 18 monuments, and really builds this national park system. He creates the U.S. Forest Service. And this is, when we think of America today and all of these great, beautiful national parks that they have, it really comes back from Teddy. And so this is seen as probably one of his greatest accomplishments. Now, there's always a downside to this. He wasn't, I would say, the most respectful, for lack of a better term, of indigenous populations within America. And so he kind of shuffled a lot of them off land and saying, well, this is federal land now. And, it's something that's a little bit of when you look back on his, reputation in terms of race relations and indigenous relations, definitely wasn't good for any of them. Maybe wasn't bad, but just kind of very neutral. So, he's doing all of these great things, but he's definitely, more interested, I think, on the business side of things and cleaning that up versus some of these other rights that will come later within America. And so just to kind of get an idea of what's the White House like at this time, he's got a boxing ring in the White House. He's sparring with military aides and actually had a punch that detached his left retina, leaving him blind in that eye, which he kept as a secret for the rest of his life. His oldest daughter, Alice, became an instant celebrity for her free-spirited antics, from smoking on the White House roof to keeping a pet snake in her purse. Roosevelt adored her, but jokingly quipped once, "I can be president of the United States or I can control Alice. Don't ask me to do both." And, Alice pokes fun back and saying, my father always wants to be the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and the baby at every christening. So this is just, he's larger than life. His kids are larger than life, and they seem to have a pretty good relationship. But he wins actually his first term. So he finishes off McKinley's term, wins his first term. And for some reason he says, yeah, second term, I'm not going to run. And people go, why the heck did you say that? Because after some time goes on, he actually comes to regret this, but he sticks to his word and says, I will not seek an election for a third term, second elected term. And he picks a very loyal friend. And this is the Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, to be the Republican nominee. And he thinks, he's going to carry forward my progressive cause. And so he has Roosevelt's endorsement. Taft wins easily. And in March 1909, Theodore Roosevelt cheerfully hands the keys to the White House to Taft and goes, all right, see you later. I'm going to go off on, a grand adventure, because of course he's going to go do that. So Taft is in power and Teddy's off, doing his thing.
Yeah, I think he ends up going on a year-long safari in Africa, hunting big game and kind of just giving the political world time to adjust to his absence, which is pretty remarkable. And I think many people would have assumed that his political career was over at this time, that he would, rest on his laurels as this kind of elder statesman, even though, he's not that old. But, the call of leadership and that strenuous life never kind of left him. And then, by 1912, I think we kind of foreshadowed this a bit. The progressive movement is at fever pitch, and Roosevelt, at only 53, is still bursting with vigor, finds himself drawn back into the fray of one of the most, dramatic comeback attempts in American history.
Yeah, he's back. He's from this safari where, he kills over 500 animals. And some people are like, all right, I thought you were the big outdoors guy and you just killed 500 animals. And there's some newspapers that jokingly put, we're cheering for the lions here. Hopefully one of them will get to Teddy before he gets to them. So yeah, he's come back. He's done that. He's even met with the Kaiser when he goes to Germany, because why not? He's an international superstar. And you're right. He comes back and he needs to get back into play. And the reason he does that is this political movement with Taft is not a progressive movement is not a progressive movement at all. Taft kind of is going back into the old ways of classic republicanism at this point. And Teddy Roosevelt goes, you know what? Fine. I'm going to challenge you, Taft, for the Republican nomination. And he comes up with the term, my hat is in the ring and the fight is on. And so he dubs something called New Nationalism, where he's calling for sweeping reforms, stricter corporate governance, more social welfare, and even talks about health insurance for the first time. And so they go through the nomination process, and like you mentioned earlier, the political machine wins. If it was a fair fight, as Teddy said, he would have won, but they're able to kind of engineer Taft's resignation. So Taft ends up becoming the Republican nominee, and Teddy goes, well, that's fine. Well, I'm going to go start my own political party. And so this nickname, the Bull Moose, comes around, and it's this party gets created, which is nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. And so he's going out there and saying, fine, I'm going to do this as part of my own party. And a lot of people who are following him from the Republican Party come over. He goes to Milwaukee in 1912 and he's giving a speech. And guess what? Just like McKinley, he's shot. But it's not like McKinley in any stretch of the imagination, because not only does he survive, he realizes that he has his speech and a metal glasses case in his pocket that kind of slowed the bullet down. He realizes, I'm bleeding, I'm in pain, but I'm fine. I'm going to finish the speech. And while he's telling the speech, he goes, friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you can fully understand me because I've just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. Like, I don't even know what to say anymore, but the crowd goes crazy. And for 90 minutes, this wounded ex-president is speaking with blood kind of coming through his shirt. And, and then eventually he goes to the hospital. They look, they say, yeah, that's wedged in there way too good. We're not going to take it out. So he just lives the rest of his life with a bullet lodged into his chest. So, ladies and gentlemen, Teddy Roosevelt.
He even joked that the bullet probably saved him from having given too long of a speech since it passed through his manuscript. And I think it just goes to show you his personality's never off. Right, he is always on, and it really just speaks to the man, right, behind the myth in so many ways.
Yeah, it's exactly what to expect by him, and it's funny. Like I was thinking of like Otto von Bismarck getting shot on his way home, going home and reading a bunch of stuff, and then tapping his wife on the shoulder, going, "I might need to go to the hospital." Again, it's just this time period. I don't know what was in the water back then, but you get some characters. But he campaigns really hard, but unfortunately, the Democrats with Woodrow Wilson, the vote isn't split, end up winning out. So Roosevelt actually finishes second, with Taft finishing third. And so splitting those votes apart, it never really had a chance. But Roosevelt's pretty happy with the way he performed in this campaign. And he's the only third party candidate in U.S. history to ever outperform a major party nominee. So, when they talk about, hey, it's a two-party system, unless you're Teddy Roosevelt, you can make it work. So, it's just his final days are coming, right, Rich? Like, he's getting old now, right? So, he's getting a little bit older. So what's he do? He finds a quiet cottage and retires, and that's the end of his life. Yeah, absolutely not. He decides to go to Brazil and go into the Amazon rainforest and go for a safari down a river that was going for its first exhibition. So again, he's a pretty old man at this point, and he decides that he's going up the Rio of Doubt, which ends up being named the Rio Roosevelt in his honor later. And so he claims, this is the last chance for me to be a boy. I want to just experience life for the final time and experience an adventure. But this is really, really hard on him. He loses 50 pounds during this trip. He has malaria that keeps coming and going. And at one point, he even says to the people that he's with, just leave me. Just keep going. Don't let me weigh you down. And they're like, you're the ex-president of the United States, one of the most popular men in the world. I can't go back up this river and saying, yeah, we left Teddy Roosevelt 40 miles back on the bank there because he couldn't make the trip. So he keeps going and he makes it through. But this really takes a toll on his health. There is no recovery from the amount of damage that this malaria has done to him and this trip has done to him. But again, in classic Teddy fashion, doesn't matter. Small infections, leg wounds, basically near death, it doesn't matter. So he gets back to America and World War I erupts, and he goes, he's really hitting on Woodrow Wilson from the sidelines, saying this, isolationist policy is absolutely the wrong way to go. We need to intervene against Germany. And so eventually that does happen in 1917, and Roosevelt's 58 at this point. And he basically goes, I'm going to raise a volunteer army and we're going to go to France. And Woodrow Wilson gets the offer. He goes, look, Teddy, we all love you. We can't send you to fight in World War I at 58 years old with the state that you're in. But his four sons go, look, our father's been telling us for years about honor, duty, and how grandfather was so upset by not going to the Civil War. So all four of his sons travel to Europe and fight for the Americans in World War I. But unfortunately, one of his sons, Quinton, is shot down in aerial combat in July 1918. And this is a devastating loss again for Roosevelt. And some of his friends noted that the old lion seemed to age overnight upon Quinton's death. So he's definitely someone who is so proud of his kids to go. he understood the risk, but I think deep down, he always expected that all 4 of his boys were going to return home safely. And unfortunately, in this case, one of them did not.
And his daughter, Ethel, actually also served as a Red Cross nurse in France as well. I don't know, the exploits of his families kind of read like a saga at this point, right? You have Theodore Jr., he led an infantry battalion and was gassed and wounded. Kermit joined the British Army in Mesopotamia and later the U.S. Army in Europe. Archibald was injured in combat so severely he was discharged with permanent disabilities. And then, Quentin, who we just talked about, who was this kind of daredevil pilot in the Army Air Service. That's the cruelest price that he had to pay. And I think there's actually a point here when he's killed in action in July. He's buried by German soldiers with full military honors near the wreckage of his plane. A gesture, I imagine, of respect for the fallen American aviator. And the Roosevelts actually, in deep in mourning, chose to leave his grave in France alongside his comrades, saying, "Where the tree falls, there let it lie."
Again, it just goes to show the power of the Roosevelt name and the respect that he's gained, not just in America now, but on an international stage. But like we said, the war is coming to an end, and Teddy's days are numbered. His health is deteriorating rapidly. All the years of injury and strain and jungle fevers for the most part. He's got all these tropical illnesses. He's got ear problems. He's deaf in one ear, but he kept active. He kept writing editorials from his sickbed, urging Americans to reject isolationism in a post-war world. And then on the night of January 5th, 1919, Teddy Roosevelt went to bed after a day of working on his book and died of a blood clot in his lungs at the age of 60. And so upon hearing these news, Vice President Thomas Marshall summed up the sentiment of many, saying, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight."
That gave me chills.
Yeah.
It's so true. It's so accurate.
Yeah.
And there goes the passing of one of the most remarkable Americans of his era.
Yeah, I think when I looked back at kind of his legacy, and I was trying to think, like, how do you even sum this guy up? Was he a great president, a great person? Like, sure, we can say all these things, but I think a few historians put it really nicely, and they just said the best way to describe him is probably the most important president, maybe of all time, or one of the most important Americans. Just regardless of what you think about him, his personality, his policy, you can't deny how important he is in the way he transformed the presidency, transformed the vision of an American, and, foreshadowed and built the foundations for Franklin Roosevelt, his New Deal and all of these things to come apart. This really starts with the work that Teddy's doing. And again, he's put on Mount Rushmore alongside Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. And, those are 3 of, you got 2 founding fathers and the man that won the Civil War and freed the slaves, and you're put next to them. I don't think you can put it, in any other way. And like we mentioned on some of the race relations stuff, that he didn't do much, but one of the things he did do was he invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, which outraged everybody. Like, what do you mean you're bringing a black man into the White House? And, that's not a good move politically, especially amongst Southern Democrats at the time. But he did it anyways because, again, he thought it was the right thing to do. And race, like we said, race relations, indigenous relations, not something he was passionately fighting for, but he understood that, hey, why not do something like this? And why not do this? And why not do that? And, have the resume that he has and really become that, strong, effective, but really just important leader in American history.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. He was many things. Reformer, rancher, writer, soldier, president, explorer. But I think above all else, he was someone who lived and breathed the spirit of his country through some of its most transformative times. And he was a man of undue passion and, unformidable principle that guided his nation from the Gilded Age through the Imperial Age, through the progressive reforms, and was still active and vocal during World War I. I think his life's kind of like a mirror held up to American history. It reflects the grandeur, the flaws, its conflicts, and in the best case, its aspirations for the direction of the country.
Yeah, you couldn't have said it any better. I think to maybe wrap up, you can't tell the story of America without Teddy Roosevelt, and I think you summed it up very well there, and I think that's probably a good place to end. But yeah, I'm surprised we even made it through his life because there's so many things to talk about. But yeah, what a man, and what an ending to a long and very illustrious and interesting life.
Yeah, great episode. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.